The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday morning, hammering against the windows of Rosie's diner with a fury that seemed personal. Inside, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee hung thick in the air, mingling with the quiet conversations of the few early risers who'd braved the storm. Water streaked down the glass in rivers, distorting the gray world outside into something abstract and melancholy. Rick Martin sat alone in the corner booth, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The ceramic was chipped at the rim, a small imperfection he traced with his thumb while staring at nothing in particular. In front of him sat a plate he'd been saving for weeks to afford. 2 eggs over easy, bacon cooked crisp at the edges, hash browns golden and glistening, and toast with real butter. Not margarine from a plastic tub, but actual butter that gleamed golden under the fluorescent lights. It was the first hot meal he'd allowed himself in almost a month. Instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches had become his existence, every spare dollar funneled toward keeping a roof over his daughter's head and food in her lunchbox. He'd learned to ignore the hollow ache in his stomach, learned to tell himself that coffee was enough, that he wasn't really hungry, that fathers were supposed to sacrifice. But today was different. Today marked 1 year since Clara had died, and Rick had promised himself he'd do something, anything, to feel human again. The eggs were perfectly done, the yolks still soft beneath their delicate membrane. The bacon was exactly how he liked it, and Rick couldn't bring himself to take a single bite. His appetite had vanished the moment he'd walked through those doors, replaced by memories that pressed against his chest like stones. Clara used to love this diner. She'd order pancakes with too much syrup, and she'd laugh at the way he'd try to steal bites when she wasn't looking. She'd swat his hand away with mock indignation, then push the plate toward him anyway because sharing was their thing. Now the booth across from him sat empty, and the only sound was the rain and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cold wind swept through the diner, carrying the smell of wet pavement and something else, something like desperation. Rick looked up more out of instinct than curiosity, and what he saw made his heart clench in a way he hadn't expected. A woman stumbled through the entrance, soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her frame like a second skin. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and even from across the room, Rick could see she was shaking. Not just from the cold. There was something deeper there, something broken in the way she held herself, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into nothing. Water pooled at her feet, spreading across the linoleum in a dark puddle. The waitress behind the counter, a woman named Doris who'd been working at Rosie's since before Rick was born, looked up with a frown that softened into concern. "Can I help you, honey?" The woman's lips moved, but whatever she said was swallowed by the sound of the rain. She swayed slightly, one hand reaching out to steady herself against the doorframe, and Rick saw it then. The desperation, the kind that goes beyond hunger, beyond exhaustion, the kind that comes from having nothing left to lose. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror during those dark months after Clara's funeral when he'd wondered if Lily would be better off without him. Rick was on his feet before he'd made the conscious decision to move. His body simply responded, the way it always had when someone needed help. Clara used to tease him about it, called him a magnet for lost souls. He'd find stray dogs and bring them home, help strangers change flat tires in the rain, give his last $5 to homeless veterans on street corners. It wasn't virtue. It wasn't a savior complex. It was just how he was wired, something in his bones that couldn't look away from suffering. He crossed the diner in quick strides, his work boots squeaking against the wet floor. Up close, the woman looked even worse than he'd first thought. Her clothes, though soaked and torn, had once been expensive. The fabric was high quality, the cut precise, but now everything hung off her like it belonged to someone else entirely. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, purple bruises of exhaustion, and her cheekbones stood out too sharply, the hollows of her face telling a story of days without proper food. "Ma'am?" Rick kept his voice soft, the way he'd learned to speak to his daughter Lily when she woke from nightmares. Are you okay? The woman's eyes focused on him slowly as if she was having trouble making sense of what she was seeing. Up close, her eyes were a striking gray like storm clouds before they break. But there was no storm in them now, just emptiness. A void where something vital used to live. I'm fine, she whispered, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the lie. You're shaking. Rick shrugged off his jacket, the only one he owned, a worn canvas thing he'd had since before Lily was born, and draped it over her shoulders before she could protest. The cold immediately bit into his arms through his thin flannel shirt, but he didn't let it show. Come sit down. You need to warm up. She didn't fight him. That told Rick more than anything else could have. People only stopped fighting when they had nothing left. When the energy required to resist exceeded what remained in their reserves. He guided her to his booth with a gentle hand on her elbow, and she slid into the seat across from where he'd been sitting, the seat that had been empty since Clara died. His plate sat there, untouched, steam still rising faintly from the eggs, and the woman stared at it with an expression that made Rick's throat tight. Not greed, not even hunger, really. It was something closer to grief, like she was looking at something she'd lost and never expected to see again. Rick slid the plate across the table toward her. Here, you need this more than I do. Her eyes snapped up to meet his, and for a moment he saw something flicker there. Suspicion. Fear. The wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness always came with strings attached. I can't, that's yours. You should. I already ate, he lied smoothly. Years of telling Lily that Daddy wasn't hungry so she could have seconds had made him an expert at this particular deception. They messed up my order, made 2 plates by accident. It'll just go to waste otherwise. She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her brow furrowed, the way her eyes searched his face for the catch, the hidden agenda. But hunger won out over suspicion, and with trembling hands she pulled the plate closer. She ate like someone who'd forgotten how. Slowly at first, almost reverently, cutting the eggs with the edge of her fork as if they might disappear if she moved too fast. Then faster as her body remembered what it needed, the primal drive for sustenance overwhelming any pretense of manners. Tears slipped down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair, and she didn't even seem to notice them falling. Rick sat across from her in silence, not touching his coffee, just watching to make sure she didn't choke or collapse. When was the last time she'd eaten? Days at least, maybe longer. The thought made something twist in his gut. When the plate was empty, scraped clean of every last crumb of egg and hash brown and toast, the woman set down her fork and finally met his eyes fully. There was color in her cheeks now, faint but present, and her hands had stopped their violent trembling. Thank you. Her voice was steadier now, though still rough at the edges. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, I did. Rick shrugged like it was nothing, like he hadn't just given away the only real meal he'd have for another month. Anyone would have done the same. No. The word came out fierce, almost angry, startling them both. They wouldn't. I've been walking for 3 days, and no one else stopped. No one else saw me. They looked right through me like I was a ghost. Rick didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just nodded and signaled to Doris for another cup of coffee, this time for the stranger across from him. Doris brought it over without comment, though her eyes lingered on the woman with knowing sympathy. I'm Rick, he offered when the silence stretched too long. Rick Martin. The woman hesitated, and for a moment Rick thought she wouldn't answer. Some people guarded their names like precious things, especially when they were running from something. Then, quietly, like she was sharing a secret she wasn't sure she should tell, Victoria Curtis. The name tugged at something in the back of Rick's mind, but he couldn't place it. Maybe she reminded him of someone, or maybe the name itself was familiar from somewhere he couldn't recall. It didn't matter. Right now, she was just a woman who needed help, and Rick had learned long ago not to ask too many questions when someone was drowning. You got somewhere to go, Victoria? She shook her head, and something in her eyes shuddered closed like a door slamming shut. Not anymore. Rick thought about his daughter, about the cramped two-bedroom apartment where they'd been living since he lost the house after Clara's medical bills ate through their savings. He thought about the eviction notice he'd shoved in a drawer last week, the one he was trying to pretend didn't exist. He thought about how there wasn't enough, how there was never enough, how he was barely keeping his head above water as it was. And then he thought about Clara, about what she would have done, about the way she never could pass someone in need without stopping, without helping, without giving whatever she had. "There's a shelter about 6 blocks from here," Rick said carefully. "St. Michael's. They're good people, run by nuns who actually care. They don't ask too many questions, and they'll give you a warm bed and meals until you figure out your next step. I can walk you there if you want." Victoria's jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might retreat back into whatever protective shell she'd been hiding in. Pride was a powerful thing, even when you had nothing else left. But then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, just once. Okay. They sat there a while longer, Rick nursing his cold coffee, Victoria slowly warming up in his jacket. The rain began to ease outside, the drumming on the windows softening to a gentle patter. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't any need. Sometimes silence was its own form of comfort. When they finally stood to leave, Victoria reached for his jacket to return it, but Rick waved her off. "Keep it. I've got another one at home." Another lie, but she didn't need to know that. Some lies were kindness in disguise. Doris watched them go with knowing eyes, and as Rick passed the counter, she pressed a small paper bag into his hands. "For the road," she said quietly. "You're a good man, Rick Martin. Don't let anyone tell you different." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that good men didn't let their wives die because they couldn't afford better treatment, didn't let their daughters wear shoes with holes in them, didn't stand on the edge of losing everything while pretending to have it all together. But he just nodded and pocketed the bag, knowing it contained the sandwich Doris always made for him when she thought he wasn't eating enough. Outside, the city smelled like wet pavement and diesel, the storm leaving everything washed clean but somehow still dirty. The streets glistened under the gray sky, and Rick walked beside Victoria in silence, steering her around puddles and broken sidewalks, hyper-aware of how thin she was beneath his jacket. They reached St. Michael's 20 minutes later, the old brick building squat and solid against the gray sky. A statue of the archangel stood guard by the entrance, his sword raised against invisible enemies. Sister Margaret was at the front desk, her lined face softening with recognition when she saw Rick. "Mr. Martin, back again?" "Not for me this time, sister." He gestured to Victoria. "This is Victoria. She needs a place to stay." Sister Margaret's gaze swept over Victoria with practiced assessment, taking in the expensive clothes beneath the damage, the hollow cheeks, the carefully blank expression of someone trying very hard not to feel anything. Whatever she saw, she didn't comment on it. "We have room. Come with me, dear." Victoria turned to Rick, and for a moment something flickered in those gray eyes. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like recognition, though that made no sense at all. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying weight beyond the simple words. "For the meal, for the jacket, for all of it. I won't forget this." Rick shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. "Just pay it forward someday. That's all I ask." She smiled then, small and sad and strange. "I intend to." And then she was gone, disappearing into the shelter with Sister Margaret, leaving Rick standing alone on the wet sidewalk with empty pockets and a strange ache in his chest. He walked home slowly, the cold seeping into his bones without his jacket, Doris's sandwich a warm weight in his pocket. By the time he reached the apartment, his fingers were numb and his teeth were chattering, but he felt oddly at peace. He'd done something good today. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. Lily was waiting for him when he walked through the door, her 8-year-old face lighting up like he'd hung the moon. She had Clara's eyes, big and brown and full of trust, and every time Rick looked at her, he felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. "Daddy, you're all wet. Where's your jacket?" "I lent it to someone who needed it more, sweetheart." Rick scooped her up, ignoring the way his muscles protested. She was getting too big for this, but he wasn't ready to stop yet. "How was school?" "We learned about butterflies. Did you know they start out as caterpillars and then they go in a cocoon and then they come out all pretty and different? Mrs. Patterson says it's called metamorphosis, and that's a really big word, but I can spell it now. Do you want to hear?" "I would love to hear." Rick carried her to the kitchen, listening to her spell out the word letter by letter, her small voice filling the apartment with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. This was enough, he reminded himself. This was everything. Later that night, after Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Rick sat at the kitchen table and stared at the eviction notice he'd pulled from the drawer. 30 days. He had 30 days to come up with 2 months of back rent or they'd be out on the street. The numbers didn't add up. They never did. His job at the warehouse paid enough to cover food and utilities, but the rent had gone up last year and he hadn't been able to keep pace. He'd sold everything worth selling. He'd picked up extra shifts until his body couldn't take any more, and still it wasn't enough. Rick put his head in his hands and tried not to think about shelters, about foster care, about all the ways he could fail the one person he couldn't afford to fail. He'd figure it out. He always did. But as he sat there in the dark, listening to the drip of the leaky faucet he couldn't afford to fix, Rick couldn't shake the image of Victoria's face when she'd looked at that plate of food. Like someone who'd lost everything and found a tiny piece of it again. He wondered where she was now, if she was warm, if she was safe. He wondered if she'd eat breakfast tomorrow. And he wondered just for a moment if their paths would ever cross again. 3 weeks passed like water through a sieve, each day bleeding into the next with the relentless rhythm of survival. Rick worked his shifts at the warehouse, loading trucks until his back screamed and his hands cracked and bled. He picked Lily up from school, helped with homework he barely understood, made dinners out of whatever he could stretch the farthest. Rice and beans became an art form. Pasta with butter was a delicacy. He'd gotten creative with food pantry donations, turning canned vegetables and expired bread into meals that Lily never complained about. The eviction notice sat on the kitchen counter now, no longer hidden in a drawer. 19 days left. Rick had started looking at shelters that took families, had quietly begun packing things Lily wouldn't notice, preparing for the worst while praying for something better. "Daddy?" Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. They were walking home from school, the autumn air crisp and bright, leaves crunching underfoot in shades of gold and crimson. "Are we going to be okay?" Rick's step faltered just for a moment. He recovered quickly, squeezing her hand and forcing a smile. "Of course we are. Why do you ask?" "Tommy at school said his family had to move because they couldn't pay for their house anymore. He said they had to live in a car for a while." She looked up at him with those big brown eyes, Clara's eyes, and Rick felt something crack inside his chest. "Are we going to have to live in a car?" He stopped walking and crouched down to her level, taking both her hands in his. The sidewalk was cold beneath his knees, and somewhere nearby a dog was barking, but none of that mattered. Only Lily mattered. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "No matter what happens, no matter where we go, we're going to be together. You and me. That's what makes a home. Lily, not the building, not the address. Us, and I will never, ever let anything happen to you. Do you understand?" She nodded, but her eyes were still worried. "But where are we going to live?" "I'm working on that. I promise you, I'm working on it." That evening, Rick went through the mail he'd been avoiding. Bills, mostly. A shutoff notice for electricity. A final warning from the landlord. And one envelope that didn't fit with the rest. It was cream-colored, heavy, the kind of paper that cost more than Rick made in an hour. His name was handwritten on the front in elegant script, and the return address was a law firm downtown. Whitmore, Jensen, and Associates. Rick's blood went cold. Law firms meant lawsuits. Lawsuits meant money he didn't have, trouble he couldn't afford. His hand shook as he tore open the envelope, already bracing for the worst, but the letter inside wasn't what he expected. Dear Mr. Martin, you are cordially requested to attend a meeting at our offices on Friday, November 14th at 2 p.m. regarding a matter of significant personal importance. Your attendance is urgently requested. Please ask for Ms. Victoria Curtis. Victoria Curtis, the woman from the diner. Rick read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. What could she possibly want with him? And what was she doing with a law firm like Whitmore, Jensen and Associates? Friday arrived faster than Rick thought possible. The offices occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, the kind of building Rick had never entered except to deliver packages. The lobby alone was bigger than his entire apartment, all marble and chrome and fresh flowers that probably cost more than his weekly grocery budget. The receptionist looked at him like he'd wandered in from another dimension. I'm here to see Victoria Curtis, Rick said, trying to keep his voice steady. I have an appointment. Her eyebrows rose, but she picked up her phone. A moment later, she gestured toward a bank of elevators. 32nd floor. Miss Curtis is expecting you. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that made the lobby look modest. A woman in a designer suit approached him with a professional smile. Mr. Martin, please follow me. She led him into a conference room with windows overlooking the entire city. Rick had never seen the city from this high up. It looked like a different world. And there, standing by the window, was Victoria Curtis. But not the Victoria he remembered. This woman wore clothes that actually fit, expensive and elegant and perfectly tailored. Her dark hair was styled, her makeup flawless, and when she turned to face him, there was color in her cheeks and light in those gray eyes. She looked like someone who belonged in this room. Rick, she said, and her voice was the same, rough with emotion in a way that all her polished appearance couldn't hide. You came. I got your letter. I have to be honest, I don't really understand what I'm doing here. Victoria's smile was small but genuine. Please sit down. This is going to take some explaining. Rick sat. Victoria took the chair across from him, and for a moment she just looked at him, studying his face like she was trying to memorize it. 3 weeks ago, she began, I was the lowest I've ever been in my life. I'd lost everything. My home, my family, my sense of who I was. I'd been wandering for days, not sleeping, barely eating, trying to figure out if there was any reason left to keep going. Rick's throat tightened. He knew that feeling. He'd touched it in those dark months after Clara died, before Lily's face in the morning had given him a reason to keep getting up. And then I walked into a diner in the rain, Victoria continued, her voice trembling slightly, and a complete stranger gave me his breakfast, his jacket, walked me to a shelter and asked nothing in return except that I pay it forward someday. She paused and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You saved my life that day, Rick. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that I had decided if one more person looked through me like I didn't exist, I was going to walk into traffic, and you saw me. You saw me when no one else did. Rick didn't know what to say. The weight of her words pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He'd just given someone his breakfast. That was all. That was nothing. I need you to understand something, Victoria said, leaning forward. The person you helped that day, the woman in torn clothes who couldn't afford a meal, that wasn't who I really am. Or rather, it was who I'd become after everything fell apart. But before that, I was someone else entirely. She stood and walked to the window, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline. My family owns Curtis Industries. We're one of the largest private investment firms on the East Coast. My father built this company from nothing, and when he died 5 years ago, he left it to me. Rick's mind reeled. Curtis Industries. He'd seen the name on buildings downtown, on the news, in the financial section of newspapers. It was one of those companies that existed in the stratosphere, so far removed from his daily reality that it might as well have been fictional. I had a breakdown, Victoria continued quietly. The pressure of running the company, the betrayal of people I trusted, a relationship that turned abusive. It all collapsed at once. I walked away from everything. I thought I could disappear, become anonymous, figure out who I was without all of that weight. But I underestimated how quickly you can fall when there's no safety net, when no one knows who you really are and no one cares. She turned back to face him. You cared. A stranger with nothing gave me everything he had. Do you know how rare that is? Do you have any idea what that meant to me? Rick shook his head slowly. After you left me at the shelter, I stayed for 2 days, long enough to eat, to sleep, to remember that I was worth something, and then I called my assistant and came back. Victoria returned to her seat. I've spent the last 3 weeks putting my life back together, but I never forgot you, Rick. She slid a folder across the table toward him. Rick stared at it like it might bite. What is this? Open it. His hands were steadier than he expected as he flipped open the folder. Inside were documents, official-looking papers with stamps and signatures, a deed, a trust document, a letter. He read the first few lines and stopped, certain he was misunderstanding. This says you're giving me a house. Not just a house. Victoria's voice was gentle but firm. A home. It's fully paid off, no mortgage, no taxes owed. It's in a good school district for your daughter. There's also a college fund for her, enough to cover 4 years at any university she chooses, and a position for you at Curtis Industries if you want it, with a salary that will let you actually live, not just survive. Rick's vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the words swimming before him. I can't accept this. You can, and you will. Victoria's voice cracked slightly, and when Rick looked up, he saw that she was crying too. Rick, you showed me what matters. A man with nothing giving everything to someone he'd never met and would never see again. That's worth more than any fortune, and I need to honor that. Please, let me give you back what you gave me. Rick thought about Lily, about the eviction notice, about the nights he lay awake, terrified of what tomorrow might bring. He thought about Clara, about what she would say. She'd be telling him to take it, to accept the gift, to stop being so stubborn. Okay, he whispered. The word came out broken but real. Okay. Victoria's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. There's one more thing. I'd like to meet your daughter, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. I don't have much family left, but you and Lily feel like the kind of people I want in my life. Rick thought about Lily, about her endless curiosity and open heart. I'd like that. She asks about you. The lady from the rain, she calls you. She wants to know if you're warm now. Victoria laughed, bright and tearful. Tell her yes. Tell her I'm very warm now, thanks to her father. This breakfast, Victoria said softly, echoing something she'd murmured in the diner. It changes everything. Rick remembered now. She'd whispered those words as she'd eaten. He'd thought she was just grateful for the food. He understood now. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the seed of something extraordinary. The months that followed felt like waking from a dream, only to discover the dream was real. The house Victoria had given them was a 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and a yard that seemed to stretch forever. Lily's jaw dropped when she saw the tire swing hanging from the old oak tree. Daddy, is this really ours? It really is, sweetheart. Forever and ever. The job at Curtis Industries was nothing like the warehouse. Rick worked in facilities management now, overseeing a team across 3 buildings. No more counting pennies for groceries. No more lying awake wondering how to make rent. No more pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Victoria came to dinner at least once a week, always with some small gift for Lily. Books, art supplies, once a telescope that had Lily talking about stars for days. She never made Rick feel like a charity case. She was just present, a part of their life that had somehow always been meant to be there. She's amazing, Daddy, Lily announced one evening after Victoria had left, her face still lit up from an hour of stargazing. She knows everything about constellations, and she said she had a hard time too, but then someone helped her and now she helps other people. Is that true? Rick smiled. Yeah, baby. That's true. Who helped her? I did. Lily's eyes went wide. You? How? I gave her my breakfast. Lily nodded solemnly. Mommy always said that the littlest things are sometimes the biggest things, like how a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. Rick held his daughter close. Your mom was really smart. I know, Daddy. I'm glad you gave Victoria your breakfast. Me too, baby. Me too. Spring arrived with a burst of color. Victoria had started bringing work to their dinners, wanting Rick's input on decisions. You see people differently than I do, she explained. I see numbers and potential. You see stories and character. I need both. There's a gala next month, Victoria said one evening. The Curtis Foundation annual benefit. I was hoping you'd come. Me? I don't exactly have gala clothes. I can take care of that. Victoria, you've already done too much. She looked at him with vulnerability and hope. Rick, you saved my life. Letting me buy you a suit is not too much. The night of the gala, Rick stood in a perfectly tailored suit, feeling like an imposter. Victoria met him at the entrance, stunning in a deep blue gown. They're judging you, she murmured as they walked in. They think you don't belong. Maybe they're right. They're not. You belong anywhere you choose to be, Rick Martin. Halfway through the evening, Victoria led him to a small stage. The music faded as she took the microphone. Thank you all for coming tonight. This year I want to share a story that reminds me why this work matters. She told them everything, the breakdown, the wandering, the diner. This man is Rick Martin. He's a single father who was facing eviction, and when he saw a stranger in need, he gave her everything he had. She turned to face him, tears in her eyes. Rick, you showed me that kindness still exists in this world. You reminded me that my life was worth fighting for. She pulled out a small velvet box containing a gold pin shaped like a butterfly. My father gave this to me when I was little. He said butterflies reminded him that transformation is always possible. You transformed my life, Rick. This belongs to you now. She pinned it to his lapel with shaking hands. Thank you, he managed. No, Victoria whispered. Thank you. Then, in front of 500 people, she hugged him. When they broke apart, Rick saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch, something like the beginning of a feeling he'd thought he'd never have again. They danced 3 songs without speaking, her head on his shoulder. Lily wants to know if you'll teach her to ride a horse, Rick said eventually. She says you mentioned having horses. Victoria laughed. I do have horses at my family's estate. Would you both come with me next weekend? I think Lily would explode with joy. And you? Rick met her eyes. I'm already pretty close to exploding with joy, honestly. The estate was breathtaking, a sprawling stone manor surrounded by rolling hills. They spent the day exploring, the library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, the stable where Lily fell in love with a mare named Butterscotch, Victoria's childhood bedroom with its lavender wallpaper. That evening, they sat on a stone bench overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. This was my mother's favorite spot, Victoria said. She died when I was 22. I think that's why I lost my way. She was my anchor. I know that feeling, Rick said. After Clara, it was like learning to walk again. Victoria leaned into him, her head finding his shoulder. How did you survive it? Lily. Every morning she needed me. She saved my life without knowing it. They sat in silence as the sun sank below the horizon. Rick, Victoria said eventually, her voice quiet. I'm not very good at feelings, but I want to be brave, like you were in that diner. Rick tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. What are you trying to say? I'm trying to say that I think I'm falling in love with you. Victoria, I don't want you to feel obligated. This has nothing to do with obligation. You could have turned down everything and I still would have fallen for you, because you're good, genuinely good. That kind of goodness is rare. It makes me want to be better. Rick thought about Clara, about the life they'd planned. And he thought about Victoria, about how she'd brought light back into their lives. I'm scared, he admitted. I already lost one person I loved. I'm scared too, but maybe being scared and choosing to love anyway is what makes it count. Daddy? They turned to find Lily behind them. What are you guys doing? Just talking, sweetheart. Lily rolled her eyes. Grown-up stuff is boring. Victoria, can we come back tomorrow? Butterscotch misses me already. Victoria laughed. I think that can be arranged. A year later, they stood on that same hilltop for their wedding. Lily was there in a buttercup yellow dress holding flower petals. I, Victoria Curtis, take you, Rick. Martin, to be my husband. I promise to see you the way you saw me when no one else did. I promise to transform with you because you taught me that transformation is always possible. Rick found his voice. I, Rick Martin, take you, Victoria Curtis, to be my wife. I promise to keep showing up every day, and I promise that our daughter will never wonder if she's loved enough. Lily pumped her fist. Best day ever. Rick kissed Victoria as the sun set behind them, painting the world in gold. That night they sat on the stone bench, looking at the stars. I keep thinking about that morning, Rick said. How I almost didn't stop. But you did stop. But I almost didn't. Victoria was quiet. I think the universe puts us exactly where we need to be. All the suffering, all the struggle, it was all leading us here. Rick thought about Clara, about how she would have loved Victoria. Yeah, he said softly. I think maybe you're right. They sat in the starlight, two people who'd found each other across an impossible divide, two lives transformed by a single act of kindness. Sometimes the smallest breakfast can change everything, and sometimes the stranger you help might turn out to be the person who saves your life right back.